I never expected my neighbors and to look at me that way, and when she said, "Don't act innocent, I know what you're thinking," my world stopped. It started on an ordinary afternoon, the kind where the air carries the faint warmth of the sun, and you don't expect anything out of the ordinary. I had stepped outside to return a book my neighbor had lent me, and that's when I first saw her. She was standing by the garden, adjusting the sleeve of her blouse, sunlight slipping through the leaves and tracing golden edges along her figure. At first glance, there was nothing loud about her presence, no dramatic entrance. But there was a quiet confidence in the way she carried herself, a calm assurance that made me pause. She turned when she noticed me, and in that moment, I felt as though the world had slowed just slightly. Her eyes, warm, steady, with a depth I couldn't read, met mine, and for a heartbeat I forgot the simple reason I had walked outside. My neighbor quickly introduced us. "This is my aunt," he said casually, as though her presence didn't shift the atmosphere. She smiled, not hurriedly, not politely, but in a way that reached her eyes, softening them into something far more inviting. Her voice when she greeted me was low and smooth, with a trace of amusement, as if she had already noticed my hesitation. She reached for the teacup she had been holding, and as she did, her hand brushed lightly against mine. It was the smallest contact, gone in an instant, yet it left behind a warmth that lingered longer than it should have. There was something about the way she looked at me, not bold, but not dismissive either. It was as if she was measuring me quietly, curious but guarded. She asked how long I had lived next door, and I found myself answering more thoughtfully than usual, aware of how intently she was listening. The faint scent of her perfume carried on the late breeze, something floral but grounded, a fragrance that stayed just out of reach. I noticed how she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear as she listened, how her lips curved slightly when I stumbled over my words, not mocking but noticing. Always noticing. It was only a brief exchange, a handful of sentences at most. Yet when she turned away, her laughter trailing lightly as my neighbor called her back inside, I realized I was still standing there, the world around me unchanged, but something inside me undeniably shifted. I didn't know it then, but that small moment, the smile, the brush of her hand, the way her eyes had lingered, was the beginning of something I would not be able to ignore. The next time I saw her, it wasn't planned. I was heading out to the street to take the trash when I noticed her by the garden, leaning slightly on the fence as she trimmed a few rose branches. The late afternoon light caught in her hair, softening it into strands of gold and chestnut, and for a second, I almost convinced myself to just keep walking. But she turned before I could. "You again," she said, her lips curving into a half-smile that seemed to know more than the words carried. It was playful, but not dismissive. I stopped, caught in the pull of her attention, and nodded with an awkward laugh. What began as a polite exchange, about the weather, about the roses, stretched into something else. She asked about my work, not in the empty way people do when filling silence, but with a genuine curiosity that made me speak more openly than I usually would. And when she talked, I found myself leaning closer without even realizing it, as if every word deserved my full attention. She told me stories about traveling when she was younger, how she got lost in a train station in Florence, how she learned to order food in broken Spanish. Her eyes sparkled as she remembered, and I realized how animated she became when she talked about the past, about things that mattered to her. I couldn't help but notice the faint laugh lines at the corner of her eyes, not flaws, but small markers of a life well lived. The world around us faded, the hum of a motorbike passing, the chatter of children running down the street. What remained was the rhythm of our voices, weaving back and forth, as if no one else existed. At one point, she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to share something funny about her nephew, and I caught the warmth of her breath, felt the nearness of her shoulder almost grazing mine. It was nothing deliberate, but the space between us felt thinner than it should have been. Her laughter stayed with me even after she turned back to her roses, waving me off with a gentle motion of her hand. I walked back toward my door with a strange weight in my chest, not heavy, but full. The kind of fullness that lingers when a moment feels too short. I didn't know why these conversations mattered so much, but they did. She wasn't just my neighbor's aunt anymore. She was becoming a presence, someone who left echoes in my thoughts long after I'd said goodbye. It happened on a quiet evening, the kind where the world seems softer than usual. The sky was deepening into shades of violet and gray, the crickets beginning their chorus, and the air carried a calm stillness. I had wandered out onto the shared balcony, not expecting anyone, when I found her there already. She was leaning against the railing, her posture relaxed but her gaze distant, as though her thoughts were miles away. The soft glow of the porch light touched the edge of her face, tracing the curve of her cheek and the gentle line of her jaw. For a moment, I didn't move. I just watched her, caught in the quiet beauty of someone who didn't even realize how striking they were in their stillness. She must have sensed me because she turned slowly, her eyes meeting mine. Something unspoken passed between us then, an acknowledgement that the air was charged with more than casual neighborly company. I stepped forward, trying to keep my composure, though I was certain she could hear the quickened rhythm of my heartbeat. We exchanged a few light words about the evening, about how the day had passed too quickly. Yet the silence between our sentences grew heavier, carrying a weight neither of us seemed willing to disturb. My eyes lingered on her a second too long, on the delicate way her hand rested on the railing, on the quiet curve of her smile. That's when she tilted her head slightly, her lips forming a faint, knowing grin. "Don't act innocent," she murmured, her voice low, almost teasing. Then, with her eyes fixed on mine, she added softly, "I know what you're thinking." The words hit me harder than I expected. They weren't accusing, but neither were they casual. They lingered in the space between us, daring me to deny them. I swallowed, trying to form a reply, but nothing came. She had disarmed me completely. Her gaze didn't waver. It held mine with a steadiness that was equal parts playful and vulnerable, as though she wanted to see how I would respond, but also as though she was confessing something in her own way. My hand brushed against the railing near hers, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence but not close enough to touch. The night seemed to grow quieter around us, every sound fading beneath the tension of that single moment. And though she eventually looked away, her words remained, circling in my mind long after, "Don't act innocent. I know what you're thinking." The days that followed carried a strange electricity. Every time I stepped outside, I found myself half expecting to see her, by the garden, at the fence, lingering on the balcony. And when I did, our conversation seemed to stretch longer, drifting from casual remarks into something more personal, as though we were both cautiously peeling back layers. One evening, she asked if I would walk with her. Her voice was casual, but the way her eyes held mine suggested it meant more than she let on. I agreed almost too quickly, and soon we found ourselves side by side, heading toward the park a few blocks away. The streets were quiet, washed in the soft glow of street lamps. The air was cool enough that I noticed the way she drew her shawl a little tighter around her shoulders. I offered to carry her small bag, and though she laughed at the gesture, she let me. It was a simple act, yet it felt significant, as though I had been entrusted with something more than just a bag. Our conversation flowed easily, but it was different now. She told me about the fears she had when she was younger, how she once dreamed of pursuing a career she never dared to chase, how she had learned to find contentment in unexpected places. I listened closely, not just to her words but to the quiet sighs between them, the pauses where her vulnerability showed through. In turn, I spoke of my own uncertainties, the restlessness of youth, the nagging feeling that I hadn't yet found where I belonged. She listened without judgment, her eyes soft, and for the first time I felt truly understood. As we walked, her sleeve brushed against my arm lightly, again and again, like an unspoken rhythm we couldn't escape. Once, when she laughed at something I said, her hand grazed my forearm, lingering just long enough to send a warmth rushing through me. It was nothing obvious, nothing anyone else would notice, but to me, it was everything. The park was quiet, the benches empty, the trees whispering in the evening breeze. We sat for a while, our shoulders nearly touching, and though the silence stretched, it didn't feel uncomfortable. If anything, it felt necessary, like the pause before a piece of music deepens. When we finally turned back toward home, there was no dramatic confession, no sudden declaration. But the pull between us was undeniable now. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something heavier, something neither of us could keep pretending wasn't there. It was the kind of evening that felt fragile, the sky swollen with heavy clouds, the air thick with the promise of rain. I almost suggested we wait before leaving, but she insisted it would hold. We were only a few blocks from home when the first drops began to fall. At first, we laughed, quickening our pace as the drizzle turned into a steady shower. The streets glistened under the streetlights, the scent of wet earth rising around us. She lifted her hand to shield her face, but within seconds her shawl was damp, the edges clinging to her arms. We darted beneath the small awning of a closed shop, the rain drumming loudly above us. She exhaled in a soft laugh, brushing wet strands of hair from her face. There was something disarming about seeing her like this, not perfectly composed, not guarded, but caught in the simple inconvenience of the weather. It made her seem closer, somehow, more real. Then I noticed her shiver. It wasn't exaggerated, just a slight tremor in her shoulders as the chills settled in. Without thinking, I slipped my jacket from my shoulders and held it out to her. She hesitated for a moment, eyes flicking to mine as though weighing whether to accept. Finally, she let out a small sigh and allowed me to drape it around her. The sight of her in my jacket stirred something deep inside me. The sleeves hung a little long, the fabric clearly made for me, not her, but the way she pulled it closer around herself made it seem as if it belonged to her in that moment. "Warm?" I asked quietly. She glanced up, and for a second, her expression softened in a way that made my chest tighten. "Warmer," she said with a faint smile, her voice quieter than the rain. We stood there, side by side, our shoulders brushing lightly in the narrow shelter. Every drop of water striking the awning above seemed to amplify the silence between us. I could feel the warmth of her presence through the thin space that separated us, the way the faint fragrance of her perfume, now mingled with rain, drifted in the cool night air. Neither of us spoke for a long while. The world beyond the awning was blurred and distant, as though the rain had built a wall around us. It was just her and me, bound by a simple gesture, yet wrapped in something that felt far more significant. When the rain finally softened, we stepped back onto the glistening street. She kept the jacket around her shoulders as we walked home, and I couldn't shake the thought that something unspoken had passed between us, something tender, fragile, and impossibly important. It was in her garden where the air always seemed calmer, as if the world slowed down once you stepped inside its quiet walls. The evening was slipping into twilight, that fleeting hour where the sky still holds a trace of gold before surrendering to blue. She had invited me in for tea, but by the time I finished the last sip, the cup sat forgotten on the table between us. We sat side by side, the silence stretching longer than usual. Yet it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it carried a weight, a fullness, like something important was hidden within it. I could hear the distant hum of cicadas, the rustle of leaves as the wind moved gently through them, but all my attention was fixed on her. Her posture was relaxed, but her eyes weren't distant the way they sometimes were. They were on me, steady, searching, as though she were deciding whether to step across an invisible line. My pulse quickened under that gaze. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled before they could leave my mouth. Then, without speaking, she moved. Slowly, deliberately, she let her hand drift across the small space between us. Her fingertips brushed lightly against mine, not fully entwining, not claiming, just testing. The contact was feather soft, but it sent a current racing up my arm, straight to my chest. I froze, but I didn't pull away. If anything, I leaned into the touch, letting her fingers rest against mine. Her hand was warm, steady, carrying with it an unspoken message I couldn't quite name but fully understood. When I finally dared to look at her, she wasn't smiling in her usual playful way. Instead, there was something deeper in her expression, a quiet vulnerability that made her seem less untouchable, more human. Her lips curved only slightly, as though she knew how much this moment mattered and didn't want to break it with words. The garden seemed to grow quieter. Even the air felt still, holding its breath with us. My heart pounded, but not from fear, more from the realization that we were both here, on the edge of something neither of us had expected but both had been moving toward all along. She didn't say anything, and neither did I. The silence was the confession. The touch was the answer. And in that unspoken moment, I knew we had crossed into something that couldn't be undone. That night in the garden didn't end with grand declarations or dramatic words. It ended the way so many important moments in life do, quietly, almost gently, as though the world itself was careful not to disturb it. We stayed there until the last of the light slipped away, until the garden was washed in shadows and the first stars began to flicker above. Our hands remained close, sometimes touching, sometimes not, but always near enough to remind me that the line between us had shifted forever. Eventually, she broke the silence. Her voice was soft, barely louder than the rustle of leaves. "I haven't felt this, alive in years," she admitted. The words carried a weight, not of regret, but of surprise, like she hadn't meant to confess it, but couldn't hold it back any longer. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "You make me feel seen," I said, the words spilling out before I could second-guess them. "Like no one else ever has." Her eyes glistened faintly in the dim light, but she didn't look away. Instead, she reached up, her fingers brushing lightly against my cheek as if memorizing the shape of me. The touch was tender, filled with something more lasting than desire. It was connection, raw and unguarded. When she leaned in, it wasn't for a kiss. It was for an embrace. Her arms slipped around me, her cheek resting lightly against my chest. I wrapped my arms around her in return, steadying her, steadying myself. For a long moment, we just breathed together, her heartbeat a quiet rhythm against mine. The world beyond that embrace didn't matter. Not the difference in years, not what others might think, not the questions that would surely come. All that mattered was the truth neither of us could deny anymore. We had found something rare, something fragile but real. When we finally pulled apart, there were no promises spoken aloud, but there didn't need to be. It was there in the way she looked at me, in the way I held her hand as I walked her back to the door. It was in the unspoken certainty that this wasn't just a fleeting moment. That night, as I stepped out of her garden and into the quiet street, I knew that nothing would be the same again. What had begun with a smile, a brush of a hand, a teasing remark, had become something that reached far deeper. And though the path ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: this connection was worth holding on to. If this story touched you, imagine what unfolds when hearts like ours collide again. Don't miss the full journey, watch the complete video linked in the description. And if you've ever felt a connection you couldn't explain, leave a comment. I'd love to hear your story.